Hi, I'm Geraldine Denning, an assistant professor from Hong Kong University and lead architect and director of Architects for Social Housing. My presentation today is called Rethinking the Danwei, Learning from the UK's Housing Crisis. From London to Berlin, Vancouver to Beijing, there is a housing crisis of affordability, access, supply and quality. Despite considerable differences in urban conditions, contexts and policy frameworks, the problem is global. 150 years have passed since Friedrich Engels published The Housing Question, but his observations about the causes of housing crises are still applicable today. Founded on the mechanics of financial speculation and the commodification of human needs, the marketisation of housing creates and exacerbates social, economic and environmental inequality. The market thrives on scarcity. Well-connected land in city centres is limited, so this renders it valuable. In a global, financialised and speculative housing market, this drives up land values, and without policies to protect inner-city areas from demolition and development, this inevitably results in socio-spatial segregation. No city can be deemed livable if the qualities of livability, a safe and healthy home, proximity to public transport, social infrastructure, parks, healthcare, schools and employment are only accessible to a wealthy few. As the charts show, there is a direct correlation in the UK between the provision of social housing and inequality, the latter shooting up with Margaret Thatcher's right to buy in 1980 and the beginning of the end of social housing. China's housing trajectory and political context is very different to that of the UK. But in the past 40 years, since Deng Xiaoping's reforms from 1979, it has also been defined by the creation of a market economy in housing. The chart on the left shows the share of private property in housing increasing from 50% in 1978 to 95% in 2014. The chart on the right, as with the UK, shows a corresponding increase in wealth inequality, with the bottom 50% reducing its share of national income from 27% in 1978 to 15% in 2014, with the top 10% increasing its share from 27% to 41%. Looking specifically at a uniquely Chinese public housing typology called the Danwei, this conference paper will outline some of the key economic and social similarities and differences between policies and practices of public housing in the UK and China. It will also illustrate opportunities for alternative regeneration strategies derived from their relative conditions. A key aspect of the UK's post-war public housing master plans was the positioning of public housing estates in well-connected inner-city locations, eventually housing up to a third of the UK's population in the late 1970s. However, since 1997, under the banner of regeneration, UK housing policy has enabled the demolition, redevelopment and privatisation of precisely these well-located inner-city social and council housing estates to unlock this valuable land. This practice has reduced the UK's stock of public housing, forced council tenants onto the private rental market and privatised lucrative inner-city land, reducing the percentage of people living in social and council housing to around 20%. In response, over the past 8 years, Architects for Social Housing has designed alternatives to the demolition of 7 housing estates across London. These proposals increase the amount of housing by around 50% on these estates, retrofit the existing stock, and renovate the community facilities and landscapes. This both enables the continuation of the existing community and improves the livability of both the immediate and wider urban context. During the socialist plan economy from 1949, housing provision in China was almost entirely funded by the state and delegated to neighbourhood work units or danwei. Constructed and managed by state-owned enterprises, these danwei housed up to 95% of China's urban working population and their families by the late 1970s. Following the housing reforms after 1979, as with Thatcher's right to buy in 1980, most of these publicly funded danwei homes were sold to their residents at reduced prices. 40 years on, China now has a home ownership rate of 96% as compared to the UK's 50%. Despite this extremely high level of home ownership, the highest in the world, the wealth gap between homeowners and renters is rising. Now, after decades of an annual economic growth rate of 10%, China's economy, like the UK and the rest of the world, is contracting, with the economy predicted to grow by only around 5% in 2024. With this economic change has come a parallel shift in housing policy, away from expansion towards urban regeneration. In addition, the household registration system, hukou, is being reformed, enabling rural migrants already living in cities to formally gain urban residency status. This then allows them to access public housing and other public services, stimulating investment in housing and infrastructure. Neoliberal policies led by the housing market are now being overturned, with the provision of social housing at the forefront of current housing and state investment in China. But where will this housing be built? Who will pay for it? And how will the regeneration processes take place? Early development of the majority of Chinese cities post-reform consisted of urban expansion and the subsequent engulfing and conversion of what had been rural or farmland into urban land. With increasing recognition of the economic and environmental importance of the retention of the remaining agricultural land in China, this program of urban expansion has now shifted. In the report Urban Regeneration under National Land Use Control, Guangdong's Three-Old Redevelopment Program, Jiji Huang writes, "The central government has made urban regeneration a key focus in China's ongoing 14th National Five-Year Plan, 2021 to 25, and the Development Vision of 2035. A key challenge will be ensuring social justice in urban regeneration." The Three-Old refers to blighted urban neighbourhoods, outdated industrial plants, and dilapidated villages. The plight of and fight for urban villages in China has been well documented, particularly around issues of economic compensation for those villages, but the regeneration strategies around other working class inner city neighbourhoods such as the Danwei haven't been as comprehensively explored. Initiated in 1949, the Danwei was a key component in the industrialisation, modernisation and organisation of the People's Republic of China. The primary mechanism for housing China's urban population under the planned socialist economy at that time, the Danwei was a neighbourhood structured around the workplace, industrial, institutional, educational or enterprise, and provided all the housing, civil and social facilities the residents needed. This created an extremely close-knit residential and working community, and also a highly socially controlled one. Danwei still form a significant proportion of low-cost housing in China's inner cities. Like their 20th century public housing counterparts across the Western world, many Danwei are located in central urban locations on high-value land. They have been and remain under the threat of demolition and redevelopment, leading to the dispersal of their communities. As in the UK, following demolition, the typically ageing, working class and migrant communities of existing Danwei are unlikely to be able to afford to purchase similar properties on the redeveloped Danwei. They would therefore be obliged to relocate away from their communities to less well-connected areas out of the city, with the negative social and economic consequences for them. The demolition involved in the large-scale urban renewal redevelopment projects has resulted in conflicts in China which echo those in the UK, between residents and the local authorities or social housing landlords. Successful campaigns to prevent the demolition of the dormitories of Chinese Academy of Sciences in North Zhongguancun, for example, took place due to residents not wanting to move out of their neighbourhood. Following Deng Xiaoping's market reforms in 1979, the Danwei were significantly transformed in terms of ownership structures. This has in some cases prevented wholesale demolition and redevelopment, but has also resulted in a lack of effective administration and maintenance of the remaining housing and communal spaces and facilities. This has led to widespread dilapidation in the Danwei, with consequent negative impact on the remaining residents. A policy mechanism introduced in 2008 for redeveloping these neighbourhoods was known as the SRP, or Shantytown Redevelopment Project. Here, the Danwei, despite being formal settlements constructed by state-owned enterprises, are now collectively referred to as shantytowns due to their dilapidated state. Due to the subsequent low rents and their, in many cases, central and well-connected locations, as well as housing many of the original Danwei residents, they also attract a growing number of new and poor economic migrants, resulting in a very diverse and fragmented demographic. The question is how to adequately house the existing Danwei communities, as well as provide homes for new migrant communities. Could ASHA's strategies for retrofitting and densification of the existing neighbourhoods be an environmentally sustainable, socially beneficial and economically viable mechanism for doing this? In 2015, Architects for Social Housing was founded to provide an architectural response to the UK's crisis of housing affordability. ASHA's research focused specifically on the estate regeneration programme, which we identified as occupying a key role in reproducing and exacerbating this housing crisis of affordability. The estate regeneration programme targeted inner-city estates, such as the Colville estate pictured here, located in Hackney in East London. The purpose of the programme was to realise the potential uplift in value of the land on which the demolished estate stood, by replacing the public housing with a majority of market sale properties. As shown here, the replacement development had properties designed by internationally renowned architect David Chipperfield for over £2.5 million. These properties are overwhelmingly purchased by buy-to-let landlords, property speculators and overseas investors, with existing residents unable to afford to move back to the redeveloped estate, as well as increasing the value of neighbouring land. This is marketing material identifying investors on the proposed demolished South Kilburn estate. In 2017, ASH were invited to a residency at the Institute of Contemporary Arts London, where we mapped the estates affected by the estate regeneration programme. At that time, in 2017, the research identified that there were 237 London estates directly affected by this programme. With an estimated average of 200 homes on each estate, that equates to around 47,400 homes, potentially constituting more than 140,000 people. Ash's argument against the demolition of London's housing estates was based on producing designs for the refurbishment and densification of 7 specific estates. These designs demonstrate that it's possible to increase the housing capacity on these estates between 50 to 80% through infill and roof extensions. By selling and renting a proportion of these new homes on the private market, it's possible to generate the funds to refurbish the existing council homes and improve the existing landscape and community facilities while leaving the communities they currently house in place. Ash's design, research and community work helped stop the demolition of 2,165 council and housing association dwellings, in the process saving the homes of around 6,800 housing estate residents. Ash's most recent project for St Raphael's estate consisted of designs for the refurbishment of all the 5 different building types on the estate. Structural engineers supported the proposals, and environmental engineers calculated that the full demolition scheme proposed by the council's architect would accrue 4 times as much embodied carbon as Ash's infill and refurbishment scheme. In addition, an independent quantity surveyor assessed the financial costs of demolition and rebuilding to be 3 times as expensive per home. Ash's work subsequently contributed to changes in housing policy, including the removal of subsidies towards the demolition of existing council and social housing properties and the prioritisation of retrofit over demolition. Deng Xiaoping's housing reforms, which opened up the previously closed social estate, provided mechanisms for private enterprise to invest in and profit from the development of housing. Now, however, the fact that such a market in housing is increasingly wealth inequality has resulted in the China government initiating a new social housing programme. Led by state-owned enterprises as opposed to private developers, the intent is to increase production of new social housing from 10% to 30 or 40%. In addition, at the end of 2021, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Rural Development gave support for the refurbishment of existing old urban residential neighbourhoods, encouraging them to focus on quality, reduce dependence on subsidies from the central government, introduce more social capital, and establish sustainable construction and management mechanisms. In 2022, the Ministry of Finance then allocated special funds to promote the progress of old residential area renovation, affordable rental housing, and shantytown renovation. Around 219 old urban residential communities built before the end of 2000 are expected to be renovated during the 14th five-year plan period, 2021 to 2025. Returning the provision of housing to SOEs points to structures like the Danway as a potential site and organisational mechanism for the future provision of social housing. But complex funding mechanisms and limited stakeholder participation still impede many renovation projects. Following the foundation of New China, Beijing, the capital city, was the site of the construction of the first Danway housing projects. It therefore still has many Danway from the 50s, some of which still resemble something close to the original. These include the Beijing No. 2 textile factory, Huagong Dayuan, and the dormitories of Chinese Academy of Sciences in North Zhongguancun, shown here. Danway compounds were originally designed following standardised urban and architectural design and construction principles. This was ideological as well as for reasons of efficiency and expediency. Borrowed initially from Soviet precedents, the urban structures acquired a range of historic Chinese characteristics which some have argued can be traced back to the Chinese walled courtyard compound, or Siheyuan, in which collective identity is prioritised over that of the individual. The urban design principles used in the Danway in the 50s include the use of partially symmetrical walled, self-contained neighbourhood compounds with mid-rise 3 to 4 storey perimeter blocks, forming partial and open courtyards in between. Drawings here of the Beijing textile factory No. 3 also show the relationship of the housing in the north to the factory in the south, and the transformation of the Danway over time with the addition of new housing from the 1980s onwards. Although reduced, the Danway do still provide some communal facilities, such as gardens and parks, shops and kindergartens. Many of the original communal facilities would have closed due to the reduced social provision of the Danway, but smaller shops and private enterprises will have emerged since the opening up. These provide both employment and low-cost commercial facilities for the residents, especially important for many of the now retired original factory workers and new migrant workers who are unable to afford to go elsewhere. The internal layouts of the blocks conform to typical designs ranging from larger family units around a common stair to shared dormitories flanking central communal corridors. The dormitory rooms would typically house a single person or a couple and do not include private kitchens or bathrooms. The larger flats, which had large bedrooms, had little to no shared living space and had only very small kitchens, encouraging communal and collective activities to take place in a canteen. Block designs and layouts vary somewhat within the downway and from downway to downway, depending on the relative success and financial position of the particular enterprise. The existing condition of the living spaces clearly needs to be addressed, and there are a range of ways in which this can take place through refurbishment. Co-housing is increasingly being explored in the UK and across Europe in housing developments in which residents share varying amounts of communal facilities, including for both the elderly and young people starting out. The downway's dormitories and flats may no longer meet current standards, but through a combination of external extensions, renovations and internal modifications, living conditions can be significantly improved without wholesale demolition, at considerably lower costs than demolition and reconstruction. Construction methods varied across time, but the original methods from the 50s and 60s typically included a solid construction of prefabricated concrete slab with brick infill walls, potentially capable of accommodating at least one additional floor. This standardisation of the original design and construction methods reveals significant opportunities for any proposals for prototypical refurbishments to the typical downway housing types to have wide-ranging applications as it did in the UK. However, the precise density of the existing housing will dictate the extent to which additional rooftop housing can be added to existing buildings. The addition of 1 to 2 floors of rooftop housing, as Ash proposed in the UK, may be prohibitive in neighbourhoods that are already very dense. Light studies would need to be undertaken in addition to structural studies on a case-by-case basis in order to ensure that any proposals do not significantly reduce light levels in the existing dwellings. Resident participation is of significant importance, both in terms of simply reaching agreement for decision-making purposes, but it can also contribute to a sense of community, particularly useful where the demographic has changed. Originally, every employee of the downway would have contributed to the management and collective decision-making processes of the downway through the Staff and Workers' Representative Council, a Chinese cousin of the Soviet Workers' Councils of the Soviet Union. Around 10 to 15% of the workforce were elected to this council to represent the rest of the residents. Some of these processes remain in place within state-owned enterprises and downway for decisions about the living and built environment to be made by the resident population. In many cases, 80% of residents need to agree that the work can take place, and the complex ownership structures may well be preventing major decisions from getting implemented, particularly when private financial contributions are needed. However, not all residents are necessarily able to participate in this decision-making process, notably the retired and migrants, both of which compose a large proportion of the existing population. Alternative organisational structures, such as community land trusts, may turn out to be useful mechanisms in thinking about funding and development in areas in which previous organisational structures are proving unsuccessful. A community land trust, for example, would be able to raise funds and enable a range of individuals, as well as groups, organisations and enterprises, to all own shares in a neighbourhood or urban area. Some form of sweat equity might even be potential in some cases. In the case of West Kensington and Gibbs Green estates in West London, it was proposed that the Community Land Trust could fund leaseholders who were unable to contribute to their part of the refurbishment, at least until the flat was sold. China already has a rural land trust as a mechanism to deal with collective rural land, so this may be a useful familiar route. As can be seen in these two plans of central Beijing on the left and Hefei on the right, the percentage of area that was originally occupied by downway compounds in cities was and still is considerable. In some cities, around 60% of Chinese inner-city housing is still in some way controlled by the downway. Although the structures for government funding for the downway were fully dismantled by 1998, the built form and organisational structures still persist in many cases, albeit transformed to a greater or lesser degree. The changes that have taken place in the years since the reforms are varied and depend on a range of factors, including economic success and durability of the original downway institution, geographic location within the city and the desirability and value of the land on which they're situated, and the quality of the original built structures. Transformations to the original downway include partial infilling for new housing, partial demolition of redundant structures and their replacement with new housing, total demolition with the relocation of housing altogether to peripheral sites, and dismantling of the downway altogether as a result of bankruptcy. As mentioned earlier, the China government have already acknowledged the need to refurbish and renovate existing old urban residential neighbourhoods, or downway, through a variety of recent policy interventions. As a result, we can see a number of successful renovations, including, for example, the Kammerich Danwei on the outskirts of Beijing by Zhao and Standard Architecture pictured here. Composed of a furniture factory and the communal factories of dormitories, communal facilities of dormitories, canteen and sports facilities for the workers, the project demonstrates that the sensitive refurbishment of such structures is possible. There does, however, appear to be a gap between the funds available to the state-owned enterprises undertaking the projects and the project costs. In the UK, the funds for the refurbishment were proposed to be raised through the construction and sale or rent of new homes constructed as infill or roof extensions. The extent to which this is possible in China's Danwei depends on a range of factors, including existing building density, and remains to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. There has been a movement in Chinese cinema over the past decade or so to critically reflect upon the good and bad of China's past. This is exemplified by the film So Long, My Son by Wang Xiaoshui. Situated in a Danwei, it interrogates the relationships between the social, architectural and political spaces embodied there, not to deny but to sift the good from the bad. This demonstrates a healthy willingness within Chinese contemporary culture not to deny its past but to learn from it. Returning to the Danwei offers a way to critique and rethink the future of housing policy in China, one that returns to housing as a social need for living in, not as a site of speculation. Ultimately, if Chinese cities are to ensure their current population are able to live in healthy, livable and well-connected inner-city neighbourhoods, the refurbishment, retrofitting and improvements of the Danwei housing, community, facilities and landscapes could be a way to achieve this. Thank you.